Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlotte Duval-Antoine. I am the Ottawa Operations Manager and a Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, as well as the Executive Director and Gender Advisor at the newly created Minds Network Triple Helix. It is a pleasure to be among you today, and I'm very thankful to NAADSN for having me. It is my pleasure to introduce this panel on alliances and their role in North American and Arctic security. And we have a lovely rosters of speakers I'm very excited to hear. But first, some rules of engagement. The presentations are going to last 15 minutes each. And once all the presentations are done, I will give the floor to you, the attendees, to ask your questions directly to the speakers. And if you please can remain muted throughout the presentations, that would make our lives easier, especially Nicole's and Ryan, who are dealing with the back end today, and also for respect of our speakers and as not to distract them. So without further ado, we're gonna hear from Nicholas Gillespie, who is an MA candidate in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, a research fellow at the North American and Arctic Security and Defense Network, and a student fellow and research assistant at the Center for Defense and Security Studies. His interests include Canada-US defense relations, Arctic security, and military history. Nicholas, over to you.
Well, great. Thank you, Charlotte, for the warm introduction. And thanks to Nicole for all your hard work.
Yep. Sorry, apologies.
Sorry. For all your hard work organizing today, and to Dr. Dean, Dr. Lockenbauer, and the rest of the network. I'm just going to share my screen here with you all. If someone could give me a thumbs up. Good. Awesome. All right. So defense cooperation between Canada and the United States was limited, if not non-existent, before World War II. The two military departments briefly discussed the Juan de Fuca Strait in 1938. An RCAF officer was posted in Washington in spring 1940, and staff talks in July 1940 were inconclusive. But beginning with the establishment of the Canadian legation in Washington in 1927, there was a slow rapprochement, which can largely be attributed to four factors. First, the personal diplomatic relationship between Mackenzie King and Franklin Roosevelt. The second, geographic proximity increasingly linked societies, cultures, and economies, especially with the 1935 Free Trade Agreement. Three, increasing great power competition in Europe and Asia threatened North America. And four, the rise of Odie Skelton's North Americanism, centered on the idea that both countries are bound by economics, ideas, and interests. So in 1938, during the Sudetenland crisis in Czechoslovakia, Roosevelt made a remarkable pledge while receiving an honorary degree at Queen's University in Kingston, that the United States would not stand idly by if domination of Canadian soil was threatened by any other empire. Caught off guard, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King responded 2 days later that Canada has the obligations as a good and friendly neighbor that should the occasion ever arise, enemy forces should not be able to pursue their way either by land, sea, or air to the United States across Canadian territory. These statements are known as the Kingston Dispensation and the Canadian Corollary, termed by historian David Beatty and political scientist David Hageland. 2 years later, in August 1940, while campaigning for the presidency in upstate New York, and during the height of the Battle of Britain, Roosevelt asked King to join him on his train to discuss the matter of mutual defenses of our coasts on the Atlantic. King and Roosevelt issued a joint press release known as the Ogdensburg Agreement, creating the Canada-United States Permanent Joint Board on Defense, or PJBD. The PJBD is a civilian-chaired defense advisory board that makes recommendations on mutual continental defense issues to the Prime Minister and to the President. Its broad mandate includes considering the defense of the north half of the Western Hemisphere. The Kingston Dispensation, which is Roosevelt's statement, the Canadian Corollary, King's response, and the Ogdensburg Agreement are the foundation of the Canada-US defense relationship. It is noteworthy that while the two executives declared a mutual defense alliance, it is an informal agreement in the sense that it was never ratified in Parliament or in Congress. It was treated as an executive order in Washington and passed as an order in Council of Cabinet in Ottawa. The PJBD had and has two co-chairs, a Canadian and an American. The firsts were O.M. Bigar, the former Canadian Chief Electoral Officer, Judge Advocate General, and a close confidant of King's. The American, Fiorello LaGuardia, Mayor of New York City, and political backer of Roosevelt's New Deal. The co-chairs enjoyed ready access to the executives and were handpicked, with LaGuardia often flying to Washington to discuss PJBD meetings with Roosevelt on a whim. And immediately, the PJBD acted quickly, spurred by the extreme sense of urgency given World War II. In its first 5 years, the board made 33 recommendations and met 42 times. Its recommendations on sensitive issues included the defense of then British colony Newfoundland, the construction of the Alaska Highway, and what to do with German prisoners of war. But in the immediacy of the post-war period, the PJB recommended the creation of the Military Cooperation Committee, or MCC, in 1946, to focus on exclusively military issues. And in 1947, American civilian agencies like the White House National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency were created by President Truman's National Security Act. And these actions initially reduced the amount of PJBD meetings and thinned its agenda. But by 1950, North American defense had taken on urgency once again, which largely resembles the geopolitical situation of today. Russia had advanced nuclear capabilities, the communist regime took control of China, and the Korean War began. The PJBD entered what Dr. Joseph Jockle calls the Second Golden Age from 1950 to 1953, advising on such issues as command and control arrangements for NORAD, the Pine Tree Line, the Mid-Canada Line, and the DEW Line, and the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway. As a direct line of defense advice to the President and to the Prime Minister, the PJBD benefits from discussing sensitive topics in a frank manner, away from media spotlight and away from public access. Because the civilian co-chairs are, in theory, handpicked by the heads of government, these choices provide signals as to how the agenda and relationship is viewed by each state at any given time. The board has no executive or decision-making authority. It simply provides advice to the executive on mutual issues of continental defense. The current co-chairs report to the US Secretary of Defense and Canadian Minister of National Defense. Canadian is John McKay, Canadian co-chair John McKay, a lawyer and longtime Liberal MP who has served on numerous parliamentary committees. The American is Melissa Dalton, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Hemispheric Affairs, a practitioner and a technocrat with a direct line of access to the US Secretary of Defense. And PJBD membership is proxy of government or military service. Representatives are from the Defense Departments, Foreign Affairs and State, the Air Forces, the Armies, the Navies, Public Safety and Homeland Security, NORAD, the Privy Council Office, National Security Council, the joint staffs in both countries, the Coast Guards, embassy personnel, and appropriate expert witnesses relevant to the meeting's agenda. And administrative support is now provided by D&D Adian Paul and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and International Security Affairs. So during the Cold War, the PJBD's role in continental defense planning evolved from just making formal recommendations during World War II to a more consultative role that saw the board studying and advising on the defense issues of the day. These topics are still lengthy and include oil pipelines, operational requirements for radar stations, US air bases in Goose Bay and Argentia, anti-ballistic missile defense systems, modernization of the DEW Line into the North Warning System, underwater acoustic surveillance systems, NORAD renewals every 5 years, and the PJBD endorsed the North American Air Defense Modernization Program in the mid-1980s. And after the Cold War ended, the PJBD still endured, and it continued to play a role in continental defense planning, even as America was the hegemon and unipolar power, meaning that North American defense had taken on a lesser priority in Ottawa and Washington. But the PJBD did not fall into dormancy, and it still studied and advised on an expanded scope of issues, NORAD's drug interdiction role, US global protection against limited strikes, missile defense program. The PJBD was tasked with reviewing environmental matters related to NORAD operations, the Y2K software bug at the end of the 1990s, and further study of the co-management of the North American power grid. And sensing the trend here, after 9/11, the PJBD still had issues to discuss. It endorsed the Binational Planning Group's recommendation that NORAD become a multi-domain command with the addition of the Maritime Warning Mission, ordered the NORAD Next and Evolution North American Defense Studies, endorsed a tri-command framework for Arctic cooperation, fostered closer Coast Guard cooperation, endorsed the 2011 Beyond the Border Initiative, coordinated with US Southern Command to coordinate drug interdiction, discussed the ongoing Haitian crisis, and endorsed a joint implementation plan to encourage both governments to move at greater speed relative to NORAD modernization acquisitions. And the 240th meeting of the PJBD was held last October in Ottawa, and it was the first in-person meeting since 2019. McKay and Dalton, she is the second Biden co-chair, led discussions on NORAD modernization, climate change, and Arctic security, global and hemispheric security issues, including Haiti, and continued cooperation on key strategic defense guidance efforts. The PJBD reviewed a framework to guide NORAD modernization efforts to improve capabilities necessary for NORAD to conduct its aerospace and maritime warning and airspace control missions. This new trend of issuing press releases after the board's meetings or the public notice of the PJBD's activities, which then have to be inferred relative to the geopolitical environment. But the PJBD has withstood little academic analysis during its existence. The last study on the board was by David Beatty at Michigan State University in 1969. Much of the academic literature since has described the board as moribund, in decline, or having been eclipsed. My research has highlighted 4 criticisms and weaknesses. First, existing institutions and organizations like the Military Cooperation Committee, NORAD, service-to-service relationships, and other bilateral arrangements means the PJBD's agenda is thin and there's less to discuss. However, it can operate as a check and balance by its function of studying and advising as a body of sober second thought. Second, Dr. Jockle calls the PJBD the permanent joint boondoggle, where nothing of utility is discussed that cannot be done in other forums. The only sort of measure of success the PJBD has is whether the Prime Minister or the President have confidence in their co-chair. Third, the PJBD's ability for success presupposes that the co-chairs have close relationships with their Prime Minister or President. It is difficult to ascertain the level of closeness between the two because we are not there for their conversations. There's also a mismatch in co-chair equity when there are technical experts versus elected officials in the positions. 4, it is difficult to know the impact PJBD advice really has. Few people know the board's existence and do not seek out its advice or review its recommendations. There's no feedback loop or review mechanism to determine whether the advice was timely, relevant, or appropriate. But to counter for these weaknesses, the board also has many successes. First, the PJBD provides utility to senior public servants and military command teams with validation when it endorses an issue and serves as an example of enduring binational cooperation. Second, tradition of secrecy is of immense value so that board members, who are technocrats, can better understand each other's positions in a low-stakes atmosphere. 3, to borrow from Dr. James Ferguson, the PJBD has the ability to, quote, cut across bureaucratic obstacles and barriers to senior political authority for action with recommendations, unquote. This allows pressing defense issues to be appropriately expedited for consideration to relevant decision makers. 4, the term advice can be interpreted rather broadly and allows the PJBD to play other roles and functions as needed. 5, today's geopolitical environment is comparable to 1950, when the PJBD entered its second golden age and represents an opportunity space for closer Canada-US coordination and integration. 6, the PJBD has shown ability to expand and change its agenda, important flexibility given the blurring of defense and security issues today. And 7, longevity on its own provides a momentum. Even through peaks and valleys of attention and activity, the PJBD has endured, is agile, and is flexible. The PJBD also has many new topics to consider, which I will just leave for you due to time constraints, but pretty much any issue they can consider. My research also concludes with 5 policy recommendations. 1, the diverse array of perspectives and viewpoints from its membership is reason for both governments to call upon and utilize the PJBD more often. Big and challenging issues can be talked about in meetings without the fear of reprisal or commitment. Second, increase availability of the board's record of actions within the declassification procedures in both countries. A simple fast fact sheet and timeline of general advice discussions would be invaluable, easy to coordinate, and increase the PJBD's reputation as a viable advice provider among the scholarly community, if not the public. Three, ensure reports from the co-chairs are not arriving in letter form, but rather face-to-face conversations with their minister or secretary, so that when an urgent situation does arrive, there is the possibility that the issue is appropriately expedited. Four, the PJBD's secrecy is both a blessing and a curse. Publicizing the board's meetings goes against its founding values as a body for frank and private discussions. But to raise the PJBD's profile as a viable and useful forum, the board should begin the practice of issuing a joint communique, topics discussed, and update its current membership after every meeting. The secret U.S. Defense Policy Board even does this, and the International Joint Commission can serve as an example. And five, and then I will stop because Charlotte's looking at me, there is an opportunity for senior decision makers to consider the PJBD as a venue for important background discussions on defense and security issues when the PM and the president don't get along. Do I have like 30 more seconds, Charlotte? Okay. With a broad mandate to advise and study any issue in the north half of the Western Hemisphere and a track record of considering non-defense issues like computer systems, the PJBD's traditional non-defense issues. The PJBD's agenda is largely a function of the gravity of purpose given external factors, just as it was in World War II. A forum such as this is best suited to handle frank, private, and sensitive discussions, to study and recommend solutions for the pressing challenges of the day. And to borrow from Dr. Andrea Sharon, the PJBD strives to forge a continental vision unconstrained by bureaucratic stovepipes. Therefore, the PJBD should be a future source of cooperation between Ottawa and Washington for the coordination and integration of North American defense policy. It allows for closed-door discussion on big issues in an era of hyperpartisanship and great power tension. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for this presentation. Now we'll turn to Nicole Crowley. Nicole is a PhD candidate at Trenton University whose research focuses on Arctic geopolitics, NATO, NORAD, and great power competition. She currently holds a Mindsturg Joint Initiative Doctoral Award, is a NAADSN Research Fellow and the Emerging Leader Network Lead, and was the 2022 recipient of the Women in Defense and Security Canadian Global Affairs Fellowship, and she's still a fellow with us to this day. Nicole, over to you.
Hey, hello everyone again. And yes, everyone can see, and once again, Zoom is just not my friend today. Sorry, 1 second. And you can see the screen now?
We can.
Awesome. Okay, I thank you so much, Charlotte. I am very excited to share the very new, very initial stages of my current research project that looks at NATO in the Arctic with a focus on the Canadian pivot, entitled NATO and its fraying Arctic Invisibility Cloak. And let's do it again. There we go. So first and foremost, NATO has been in the Arctic since it was founded in 1949, by virtue of the fact that the alliance has had Arctic member states. This has not changed. What has changed is that since 2017, NATO has taken a more visible role in the region. This presentation is going to briefly explain why NATO has not taken a visible role in the region historically, the 2017 pivot, how NATO now behaves in the region, and will finally conclude on what this change in visibility could possibly mean for the Arctic theater going forward. But first, a little bit of background on NATO so we're all on the same page. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded in 1949 with 12 original members, including Canada. It was created with the ideas of keeping the US in, the Germans down, and the Soviets out. The alliance was created to be a military and political alliance, as NATO recognized and continues to recognize that security in our daily lives is key to our well-being. NATO's purpose is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means. Today, NATO has 31 members, soon to be 32, now that Turkey has agreed to send Sweden's bid to ratification. But this 32 will include 7 of the 8 Arctic states, the like-minded 7. The 8th Arctic state is obviously Russia, who clearly is not a part of NATO. So, since NATO has always been in the Arctic, the question becomes, why has the alliance stayed under a cloak of invisibility, instead of taking a more visible role, like it has done in other theaters? Well, the answer is, drumroll please, it's Canada. We are the problem in this instance. But all jokes aside, it really was Canada that has historically been incredibly vocal against NATO taking a very visible role in the region, particularly in the North American Arctic. Canada's position was based on a few points. First, the state has always been a strong proponent that Arctic states should be the ones controlling decisions made for the Arctic. Second, the North American Arctic is fully secured through NORAD. And third, Canada is concerned that NATO having a visible role in the region would create a security dilemma for Russia, and thereby creating an Arctic arms race, something Canada really wants to avoid. But not all NATO states were in agreement with the Canadian position. Norway, another founding member, has been a very strong proponent of NATO taking an increased role in the region. After 2008, Norway has made arguments due to the presence of new Arctic challenges, such as increased need for search and rescue, environmental protection, and general domain awareness. But also importantly, it's been due to Russia's increased military assertiveness in other theaters that has been driving Norway to call for more NATO in the Arctic. But since Canada did not share the same opinion, the alliance didn't have a way forward since NATO is run on consensus. And Canada's long and strongly held position on this issue created a scenario in which within the alliance, the Arctic became known as the A word. 2017 became this turning point in NATO, Arctic, and Canada relations. This was because in 2017, Canada released its current defense policy, Strong, Secure, Engaged. This policy is designed to highlight a clear direction on Canadian defense priorities over a 20-year period. And we are supposed to see an update on this policy sometime this year, but this is our current policy. But important for the purposes of this presentation is line 110 in Strong, Secure, Engaged, particularly the last 3 words. The line states, Canada will conduct joint exercises with Arctic allies and partners and support the strengthening of situational awareness and information sharing in the Arctic, including with NATO. Now, this including with NATO was huge. But it's also important to echo Strong, Secure, Engaged when it states that while Canada sees no immediate threat in the Arctic and the North, as the region's physical environment changes, the circumpolar North is becoming an area of strategic international importance, with both Arctic and non-Arctic states expressing a variety of economic and military interests in the region. When the Trudeau government released its Arctic and Northern Policy Framework a few years later, it reiterated this position in the Safety, Security, and Defense chapter, which states, more broadly, as stated in Strong, Secure, Engaged, Canada will seek opportunities to work with our allies and partners, including with NATO, in support of our common commitment to security in the Arctic. In other words, Canada had shifted its policy towards NATO in the Arctic, its long-held opposition. And this was huge. This removed a long-held roadblock to NATO having a more visible Arctic focus. After 2017, with the approval of Canada to slip off the cloak of invisibility, NATO has become more active and more visible in the circumpolar Arctic. There's been more openly NATO exercises, such as Trident Juncture and Cold Response. Trident Juncture is a particularly notable exercise because it was the largest ever NATO exercise since the Cold War and was hosted in Norway in 2018. It was a land, sea, air, and cyberspace exercise designed to respond to an Article 5 scenario and tested the limits of NATO to sustain an Arctic operation with up to 50,000 troops from allied and partner countries for around 2 weeks. Trident Juncture followed on the heels of a massive Russian exercise in the Russian Far East and allowed NATO to demonstrate its resolve and willingness to defend its northern flank. And it was also hoped that NATO will continue to normalize its presence in the region and reinforce its Arcticness through continued exercises. In 2022, the NATO Secretary General visited the Canadian Arctic for the first time. And this was a huge deal for Canada. This visit demonstrates that the government does take this NATO pivot seriously, and it's not just simply rhetoric. Trudeau and Stoltenberg visited Cambridge Bay, which is one of the sites of the North Warning System. And they reinserted the importance of NORAD modernization, which will simultaneously strengthen NATO's North American flanks. Due to the Russian and Ukraine war, NATO also saw Finland and soon to be Sweden formally enter the alliance as members. And while their membership has nothing to do with the Canadian pivot, the expansion still needs to be mentioned because the inclusion of Finland and Sweden will greatly increase the Arcticness of the alliance. During this period of 2017 through 2023, NATO has also had important pressing areas of interest. So the fact that the Arctic is still included in this dialogue does show that they're paying it attention. We've seen the resurgence of great power competition and how it's impacted the international system. COVID-19 and COVID-19 responses has been a huge pressing focus for the member states. And now the alliance has mobilized resources to reinforce its eastern flank in response to Russia. This has not been a quiet period of NATO existence. But still, the Arctic is showing up in visits, in op-eds written by NATO officials, and it gets included in important speeches. As Stoltenberg put it in the op-ed he wrote in 2022, in this more dangerous and competitive world, NATO is increasing our presence and vigilance across the alliance, including the High North. With strength and unity, we'll continue to deter aggression, protect our values and interests, and keep our people safe. So, we've established that NATO is becoming more visible in the High North, and Canada has removed its objections in regard to having a visible NATO in the Arctic. So, the question becomes, how does having a more visible NATO impact the region? First, I want to remind everyone that political science has an abysmal track record for predicting the future. And second, we're most likely not going to see the full impacts on Arctic governance until after the war is over and we start to see diplomatic channels with Russia resume in this theater. So, that being said, what could change? Well, in the short term, not so much. NATO doesn't have a specific Arctic policy, but it also doesn't really need one. It already has an institution set up for cold weather operations in Norway called the Cold Weather Operations Center of Excellence, and the NATO Arctic is already covered by local defense arrangements, NORAD in North America and NORDEFCO in Scandinavia. And it is important to remember that the entire NATO Arctic will be covered via Article 5. An attack against one is an attack against all, regardless of whether or not it has a specific Arctic policy set up. The nature of threats facing different regions of the NATO Arctic and the changing nature of the Arctic climate itself is so varied that it makes it difficult to create a cohesive, unified NATO plan for the region. A second point to consider is that while the Northern NATO expansion may be a source of politically charged rhetoric and make it harder to communicate / work with Russia in the long term, it could also provide stability in the region because it solidifies state action and reaction, thereby increasing the fog of uncertainty in the international theater. Point 3, before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, NATO having more of an opening in the region did not majorly impact circumpolar governance. And when the war is over and communications hopefully get restored with Russia in relation to the Arctic, it is unlikely that NATO is going to be this massive sticking point. Instead, the Arctic states are going to be focused on how to rework the Arctic Council. And after all, the first footnote in the Ottawa Declaration, the founding document to the Arctic Council, says that the Arctic Council should not deal with matters relating to military security. What I'm personally curious about is if the Arctic Coast Guard Forum gets impacted by NATO having a more overt role in the region, because of how some Arctic militaries are involved in the forum due to how their respective Coast Guards operate and who has responsibilities for Coast Guards. My guess is that NATO won't impact the forum too much, if at all, but it's definitely an area I'm keeping my eye on going forward. So in conclusion, NATO is and has always been in the Arctic. Since 2017, NATO has had the opportunity to create space for a more visible Arctic role. And while it may be a while before we truly see the 7 versus Russia dynamic play out in the Arctic, it's important to remember that the most serious Arctic governance shaking impacts on the Arctic have not come from a more visible NATO, but they've come from Russian aggression. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole, for this fascinating presentation. Now we'll turn to Jim Davich, who has served as an officer in the U.S. Air Force for over 20 years. Among other assignments, he was an instructor to the United States Air Force Academy and the U.S. Air Force Weapons School. He recently authored a chapter in the Air Force Academy's main warfighting textbook and has written multiple journal articles on topics including critical thinking, metacognition, and the role of defense intelligence in national security strategy. He holds a BA in international politics from Penn State University, an MA in interdisciplinary studies from the University of Oklahoma, an MS in air power strategy and technology integration from Air University, and a PhD in governance and globalization from Virginia Tech University. Jim, welcome, and over to you.
Hi, thanks. Can you see the screen? All right, great. Thanks. Thanks for having me, Nicole and Bridget. This is a condensed version of my PhD dissertation that lasted for about an hour and a half, and condense it down to about 10 or 15 minutes. The purpose is to kind of talk about my research, and which really focused on thinking about how the United States and Canada thought about the problem of airspace securitization sort of after the Cold War and into the 1950s and 1960s, sort of that second golden age that Nick was talking about. I can get into a lot of the methodology, but I'd rather not. I'm kind of sick of talking about it. I'll just suffice to say I used a lot of, it was an archival project using some critical discourse analysis, looking at how not only senior political and military leaders talked about defending North American airspace, but also how lower level military folks in NORAD talked about it as well. And just the obligatory disclaimer that I've got to do whenever I talk, views and opinions expressed or implied in this presentation are mine alone, should not be construed as carrying the official sanction of the Department of Defense, the U.S. Air Force, or other agencies and department of the government. Sorry, got to say that. Okay, moving on. So the, sorry, let me go to my slideshow. Okay, so just backing up, as Bridget mentioned, I was an instructor at the U.S. Air Force Academy, which is that beautiful picture on the screen. So I was going into my PhD thinking I would like to study something related to the Air Force and ideally something current. And I ended up going sort of 50% of the way there. I found this subset of critical geopolitics that talked about this idea of vertical geopolitics. And I kind of feel like the character in Mean Girls, who's trying to make fetch happen. I'm trying to make vertical geopolitics happen. What it is a way of thinking about, geopolitics, but also moving beyond the kind of horizontal, two-dimensional version of thinking about conflict and security studies that is conveyed through things like maps. You see the classic Schlieffen Plan, German invasion in World War I on the top right corner of the screen. These kind of maps prevent us from thinking about the volume and depth inherent in conflict. And so vertical geopolitics kind of seeks to go back and say, wait a second, let's rethink about the considerations that we're missing when we only think about things like armies and ground forces and seizing terrain or territory. And we see that a lot in Ukraine, where we talk about this city's been lost, this city's been gained. And it's very focused on land warfare at the expense of what's going on above and below. Vertical geopolitics has a component below ground, below water too. The vertical geopolitics literature that I started flipping through was primarily focused, and still is, on kind of drone warfare in the Middle East. And I thought that there was an opportunity to move beyond that and look at how the US thought about defending the US and Canadian, sorry, let me step back, how the US and Canada thought about defending North American airspace. And so I started digging into the archives in Ottawa, Washington, DC, and then the NORAD archives, which are at the University of Manitoba and really easily accessible. And they're fantastic. What I found in the course of that research was this massive air defense exercise, this series of exercises that NORAD conducted between 1960 and 62 called Sky Shield. And it consisted of, at its very basic level, a bunch of bombers simulating this Soviet surprise strike on North America, proceeding kind of north to the south, and then 1,500-ish friendly fighters going to greet them and waging this colossal war over North America. It happened 3 times between 1960 and 62, once a year, and then it stopped. And so that was kind of an interesting place to look at. Why did it start and why did it stop? So as I said, the exercises started in 1960, ended in 62. As I was going through the research, I kept seeing this references to the Skyhawk exercise. And for the longest time, I thought it was just a typo, or maybe something they meant to say Sky Shield, but they actually ended up saying Skyhawk. And what I found was that it's there was a whole lot of exercises preceding the Sky Shield exercises, massive continental-wide continent-spanning exercises dating all the way back to 1952 and the start of that golden age. But Skyhawk was canceled, and it made me wonder why. And so I started digging into that and found some great research from McKercher and Sale, who wrote a really interesting journal article that I'll cover a little bit later in this presentation. But also made me think about why there were no Sky Shields after 1962. Why did that golden age end? And then, kind of big picture, why did the US and Canada decide to hold air exercises at all? Why did they start them in the first place? And so that brought me back to the late 40s, post-Cold War. Kind of, if anybody's seen the new Oppenheimer movie out. 1949, the Soviets dropped their first atomic weapon. They also roll out their first long-range intercontinental bomber, the Tu-4 Bull, which, if you're fan of old airplanes, it's a direct ripoff of the US B-29 bomber that crash landed in Siberia in World War II. The Soviets rebuilt, turned it into their own plane. The graphic on the right shows the very real fear that a lot of folks in the US and Canada felt was the possibility that not only could there be a strike from the Soviet Union on North America, but it could be a nuclear strike. And that led to the creation of the securitization of North America. So late 1940s, early 1950s, there starts to scholars, both from the political science, political geography fields, start to talk about the Arctic and the possibility that the Soviets would use it as a base to attack North America. And then military theorists like Alexander D. Seversky start saying the same thing, almost using the exact same maps, showing this predicted battle space that ended up coinciding with exactly where these Sky Shield exercises were tested, kind of over the Arctic Circle. So you've got this sense of vulnerability from the atomic bomb. You've got the prevailing scholarship that's focused on this Arctic threat, leads to the White House decision to do something about it. So the Eisenhower administration decides that it's going to adopt a massive retaliation policy. They will meet the threat of warfare with the Soviet Union with a massive retaliatory response, and that is emblematic of the B-52 is emblematic of that response, the air power side of massive retaliation. But what is not discussed as much in this, in focusing on the bomber capability, is the idea that the US and Canada needed this adequate continental defense system. And what I argue is that the Continental Defense Network really underwrote Eisenhower's nuclear strategy. You couldn't have that bomber massive retaliation strategy if you didn't have an adequate continental defense system. So what does that require? I argue that the network spanning across Canada and the United States, sort of that Dew Line, Pine Tree Line, was part of it. It was also a really interesting series of computer advances making up the command and control network, fighter aircraft here like the F-106s that the US and Canada used to protect themselves. But more importantly, possibly, was the relationship, the international politics side of this between John Diefenbaker and Eisenhower, and then John Diefenbaker and Kennedy. So as this has been discussed a lot, I won't belabor it too much, Diefenbaker comes into power on a populist wave, and really puts this diplomatic side of international relations first, that cooperative diplomacy I think Jackson talked about earlier this morning, focusing on diplomacy over military capabilities. He's got his eye set on this Paris summit that's going to happen in May 1960. Leading up to it, there's a foreign ministerial meeting in 1959. Nixon goes to the Soviet Union after that. Khrushchev visits the US in 1959, right at the same time that the Sky Shield exercise is going to happen. So Diefenbaker pulls Canada out of the Sky Shield exercise, which causes a bit of a rift between the US and Canada. The reason Diefenbaker does it, because he's got all his eggs in the Paris summit basket, and he's focused on making sure that that goes well, because he thinks that's the best avenue to a peaceful resolution of the Cold War. Eisenhower's got problems with Canada. He's also got problems in his own backyard. He's got Democrats in Congress who are warning the American public that Eisenhower's not protecting him, which is kind of crazy because he won World War II, in a lot of ways. So Eisenhower, at the same time as he's dealing with all this, is not afraid as much as maybe the American Canadian public is, and that's because he's invested in surveillance technology. He's concerned, but he can't tell anybody why he's not that concerned. He's invested in overhead, space-based, and aerial surveillance capabilities, like the Corona program on top and the U-2 spy plane below, still flying today, by the way. So the U-2 program is running throughout May 1959, trying to learn as much as it can about the Soviet Union. And it's supposed to culminate with an exercise on May 1st, 1960, called Operation Grand Slam. Some of you know this probably pretty well. The U-2 gets shot down over Sverdlovsk in the Soviet Union. Francis Gary Powers is captured alive. 2 weeks later, the Paris summit is about to kick off. There's a incredibly tense environment because the Soviets had just shot down this plane and paraded the pilot on TV. Khrushchev shows up at the Paris summit, this event that's supposed to be this massive diplomatic victory for everybody, and he storms out of the Paris summit. Diefenbaker, who had expressed enormous reservations about a military approach to dealing with the Soviet Union, is instead of being upset at the Russians, instead of being upset at the US for flying spy missions over Russia, is instead angry at Khrushchev for leaving the summit. He has a meeting 2 weeks later with Eisenhower in the White House, and Eisenhower says, I would really like to join you and hold these Sky Shield exercises. Diefenbaker agrees, and shortly afterwards, Sky Shield 1 kicks off in September 1960. It was a multi-phase event, including aircraft. First phase of it was trying to get all of the aircraft across the US and Canada on the ground as fast as they could. The second phase was to try and get the bombers away without being shot down by US and Canadian defenses. And then the third phase was that attack from the polar region down south towards southern Canada and the United States. And it took all day. And one of the interesting things about the Sky Shield exercises was that it grounded all planes across the United States, all civilian aircraft, for the entire duration of the exercise. The only other time that has happened was during the September 11th attacks in 2001. Multiple angles, aircraft coming in primarily from the north, but also from the east and west, sometimes as far out as Guam and the Philippines, coming in at high altitude and low altitude. Relatively mixed results from the exercise. It's tough to tell how good the US and Canada were at shooting down, simulated shooting down of the aircraft that were flying. Nevertheless, the Kennedy administration decides to cancel the exercise for a host of reasons starting in 1962. So just to sum up, the Eisenhower White House's massive retaliation doctrine is underwritten by a adequate continental defense system. That system was consisted of computers, airplanes, radars, humans, all working together to try and build a viable defense network. To make sure that the defense system was adequate, the US employed an aerial surveillance program spying on Russia to try and learn what capabilities the Soviet Union had and what they had not, maybe more importantly. The consequence of the May 1st, 1960 shoot down was that the Sky Shield exercises could happen, which they did shortly after that shoot down when Diefenbaker and Eisenhower agreed to the exercises. So in conclusion, I argue that Sky Shield was an expression of vertical geopolitics and the changing way that the US and Canada were thinking about airspace defense. And I really point to that last Sky Shield exercise in 1962 as the high watermark for how NORAD thought about airspace defense. Afterwards, it changed, and I can talk about why later. Charlotte, I'm sorry, I forgot to set a timer. How am I doing? How much time do I have?
You have less than 2 minutes left.
All right, I'll cover it super briefly. The way that the main reason things changed and the main reason that the high watermark of air defense occurred in 1962 was because the Kennedy administration started thinking about nuclear warfare different. Whereas the Eisenhower administration put out its kind of nuclear warfighting game plan in a document called NSC 162-2. Under that massive retaliation plan, NORAD was given a lot of money and resources, and the defense of continental airspace was prioritized because it was a key leg of the nuclear program. I argue that it changed when the Kennedy administration adopted new policies that were listed in their strategy document called PSYOP 63, that then instead of prioritizing continental defense, the US and Canada airspace defense, began to prioritize non-nuclear forces and limited wars, and ultimately just deprioritized NORAD. So finally, we see airspace defense as a continuing security concern. You saw it, did my dissertation defense literally a couple of days after the Chinese balloons started going over Canada and the United States. So we see it as a continuing issue that we have to continue thinking about and responding to. And I'll take your questions as you have them. Thanks for the time to talk.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And I gotta say, I'm very impressed by the presenters so far. They all keeping on time. This is fantastic. So thank you so much for that. And last but not least, Luc Kuben, he has followed the RPM program, an MA in European history across 3 universities, the University of Leiden, the Sorbonne Panthéon 1 in Paris, and Oxford University. He also holds an MA in European Union Studies from Leiden University. The work presented here today is based on the thesis for his EU Studies degree. Luc has worked as a research assistant at the Clingendael Institute, an international relations think tank based in The Hague, and currently works as a policy analyst for the Dutch government. Luc, your turn.
Yes, thank you. And I'll, of course, try to keep in time as well. I'll share my screen. Is everybody seeing it? Yes, okay, great. So, well, of course, thank you for all people organizing this event, especially Nicole for the invitation. And then, of course, thank you, Charlotte Duval-Lantoine, for the moderation and my fellow panelists. My name is Luc, and I will tell you something about my research on Nordic cooperation on defense in the Arctic. The title Going Nordic refers to the idea that the Nordic states have different paths they can take to pursue their interest. So they can act unilaterally, they can choose to cooperate bilaterally, for example, but also to pursue their interest via these large regional frameworks, such as the EU. And then lastly, they can also choose to cooperate amongst each other. And that is what Going Nordic means. Very quickly, this research was written a while ago, basically during the invasion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the latest developments have not been part of this research, but I think they're quite a natural point for discussion at the end. And then the picture that you see here, these are the ministers of defense of Finland, Sweden, and Norway, signing a trilateral agreement to bolster Nordic cooperation in the North Cap. That's a region that I'll show a map of later on. And the beautiful scenery is Posammoon, which is in the northernmost part of Norway, just a mere 200 kilometers from the Russian border, a location, of course, not chosen coincidentally. So above you see my research question, and I want to talk mainly about the results of the research, but quickly about the sort of academic background. This is an interesting question to ask because, well, part of the answer to that question lies in the academic debate on Nordic cooperation, that it has, what I argue, is a sort of double-sided narrative. So on the one hand, the Nordics are very similar in many ways. They share a history, they have a shared culture, shared society, very similar political, economic, and bureaucratic systems. And this has resulted in a very deeply embedded cooperation, what some call a cobweb of integration. And then on the other hand, large ideas, large plans for high-level political cooperation have tended to fail. So, for example, there's the failed Scandinavian Defense Union of the 1940s. There's a Nordic Economic Community of the 60s that failed. So, a fair share of the literature talks about a sort of narrative of failures, of high ambitions and disappointing results. One important reason, by the way, that this is the case, according to quite some academics, is that the Nordics have different membership, right? So part of them are members of NATO, part of them are not, until quite recently, and a part of them are members of the EU and some are not. So this has diverged paths to pursue their interests, basically. But this double-sided narrative has basically resulted in a large central question in the debate that revolves around the question, well, what has it actually achieved, right? What is Nordic cooperation? What do we do with it? So that's an interesting question. And then secondly, a reason why I chose this is, well, basically there was not that much research, barely any research done on Nordic cooperation specifically in the Arctic. And I guess, as we all know, it's an interesting region to look at. And then very quickly about sub-regionalism. This is how I did my analysis, is I analyzed Nordic cooperation as a form of sub-regionalism. This is a form of cooperation in between the national and regional level, which allows, I argue, for a nuanced and realistic assessment of Nordic cooperation, because sub-regional cooperation should not be treated as a competitor or alternative of these larger frameworks, such as the EU or NATO. And it should not be assessed according to the same standard. Instead, sub-regionalism should be seen and assessed as complementary, or you can say supplementary to these larger frameworks, aiming to tackle challenges, both geographically and policy-wise, that regional projects have been failing to address. So this is the main arguments. It is quite simple, I guess. It's that defense cooperation between the Nordics has complemented some limits of NATO in a specific region. And I will unfold these arguments by looking at the most important explanatory factors. So firstly, a little bit about NORDEFCO in an institutional sense. NORDEFCO is the institutional structure for Nordic defense cooperation. It's a very loose intergovernmental structure, limited in institutionalization, so not a substantial own budget, rotating chairmanship, which means that in practice, the extent of cooperation is very much dependent on political will. And political will it has. Since 2014, which was the annexation of Crimea, the Nordics, there was a sort of shifting point in Nordic security thinking where all of them agreed that Russia is a real concrete threat to the Nordics, right? If it invades a neighboring country, well, they border for part of Russia as well. So from that moment onwards, political will was definitely there. Another small point to mention is that this institutional NORDEFCO is very open and flexible. So the Nordics can pursue bilateral and trilateral projects under the umbrella of NORDEFCO. So not every one of the Nordic states has to cooperate in every project. And then it's also open, which is very important. It's open to non-Nordic states. So other states, partners can join Nordic defense cooperation projects. This is called integration à la carte by some. So what means complementing the limits of NATO, right? Well, as we know from Nicole's presentation, NATO is in the Arctic. It doesn't really have an Arctic strategy in that sense. Until quite recently, Finland and Sweden were not a member of it. But that doesn't mean that NATO has not been active in the region. It actually has been, most importantly, I guess, through these large military exercises. And I think also Jim, but also Nicole already mentioned, right, the importance of military exercises is that they right, in a rapidly securitization of the Arctic, they increase military readiness and operationality, and also they have a sort of political and strategic function, right? They are used to demonstrate capabilities, willingness to fight to potential adversaries, and to build and maintain partnerships with allies. So NATO has had these exercises, I think, called Response and Trident Juncture, which you see here today on this presentation. Nicole already mentioned. There's also Dynamic Mongoose, which I think is a fabulous name for a military exercise. And then what you see is that these exercises are mainly focused on the North Atlantic, the Norwegian Sea, and Norway. And then the region where it has failed to sort of establish, is my argument, is this region that I encircled with a yellow circle, which is called the North Cap, which is the northernmost part of Scandinavia. And this is an important region for Sweden and Finland, but also Norway, because they border Russia there. And on the other side of the border lies what's called the Kola Peninsula, and that's where quite a lot of the Russian military in the Arctic is situated. I think it's even where the headquarters of the Russian Arctic Fleet is. So this is also where NORDEFCO has been most active in the Arctic, in this region. And in a sense, it has therefore filled the gap that NATO has been unable to address. So how have they provided them with security guarantees? Well, through cooperation, both amongst each other and then also with partners. So firstly, Norway, Sweden, and Finland have established weekly air exercises in the North Cap region between the airports of Bodo, Kallax, and Rovaniemi. So there has been weekly air exercises quite a while. And this, of course, practically enhances military readiness and joint operationality. And on the basis of this cooperation, the agreement was signed that I mentioned in my introduction. This is a trilateral statement of intent to further bolster cooperation. And then secondly, NORDEFCO has involved NATO partners in the North Cap through the biannual Arctic Challenge exercise. This is a large-scale operation that has developed into a flag-level exercise. It has grown considerably and was the largest air exercise in Europe for a while, if I'm correct. And this exercise, of course, has because of the grandness of it, because it's a large exercise, it has that political strategic message, right? To show that the Nordics are willing to and able to defend themselves in the North Cap together with partners. And that message is evidently meant for Russia. So I guess to conclude, NORDEFCO has allowed NATO and most importantly the US to train in the North Cap, and it has allowed Finland and Sweden to cooperate more with NATO. And therefore Nordic cooperation, I argue, has had a bridging function in the North Cap, allowing the Nordics to bridge their divergences in NATO membership. And then secondly, it has led the way for NATO to become more involved and provide security guarantees. And then quickly, maybe the future, right, of NORDEFCO. I think this is an interesting question to ask to Nicole, right? Will NATO take over NORDEFCO's role in the North Cap? Will it sort of swallow the Nordic Defense Cooperation as Finland and Sweden become members? I don't know. The most recent developments, well, the Arctic Challenge exercise of 2023 actually grew again. And then in 2022, a new NORDEFCO North of the Cap agreement, similar to the one I mentioned in the introduction, was signed. So I guess the message remains unanswered. Thank you.
Thank you very